started here. So today our webinar is titled A Legal Perspective on the Use of AI in EMS, and I am very privileged to introduce Ryan Stark of Page Wolfberg and Wirth. He is a managing partner with Page Wolfberg and Wirth, and he's the firm's resident HIPAA guru, according to their website. He counsels clients on labor relations, privacy, security, reimbursement, and other compliance matters affecting the ambulance industry. And today he's going to be here talking to us about AI and exploring healthcare laws, regulations, and emerging policies that apply to EMS organizations. And so we're excited to have you here, Ryan. Go ahead and you can get started.
Thank you very, very much, Chris, for the introduction. And I'm privileged to be here. Thank all of you for joining us. Good morning to some of you, and good afternoon to all of you on the East Coast here. So it's really a pleasure to join you guys. So what we want to cover here is sort of the burgeoning area of legal regulation surrounding the use of AI. And no surprise, as any new technology comes onto the scene, the regulations take a while to keep up, and there hasn't been a whole heck of a lot of regulation yet, but we're starting to see it be regulated on the state level. It does interact with a few federal laws that we're going to mention as well, but I want to point out some of the risks and some of the things that you can forecast in looking forward. And the important point to make here is this stuff is rapidly evolving. We don't know what this is going to look like and what the landscape is going to look like 2 years, 3 years from now. So we're kind of getting a snapshot of where things are today, and things are sure to evolve in the future here. So I just wanted to point out these are the organizations that I'm affiliated with. PWW is our law firm. We've been in practice for 25 years now. Our consulting arm is PWW Advisory Group, and here are the fine folks that represent our organization. I have to give the standard lawyer warnings here. This is all copyrighted material. I'll mention again that I will provide a copy of PDF slides to Chris so that they can be distributed, or you can email me directly and I can give you a copy of the slides after this. I literally was putting this presentation up until about 5 minutes ago, not 5 minutes ago, about 10 minutes ago before I jumped on the call. So we are completely up to date with everything, right? So the other disclaimer is that this isn't legal advice. I do have to say that I'm only licensed to practice law in the state of Pennsylvania. A lot of this new regulation is coming up on the state level, and we'll talk about why that is. But really be sure to check with your state council concerning different regulations surrounding this, especially on the labor side. That's where a lot of us get into trouble. And there have been some regulations of using AI for, labor related things, staffing issues and things of that nature. So wanted to point out, we've been collaborating with NEMSIS now, gosh, for it's almost 2 decades now, way back when NEMSIS was first on the scene and collecting information from the various state EMS offices. They need a little bit of help fleshing out their authority to do that, and the fact that HIPAA permits these types of transactions. So we authored a letter way back then, and since then have authored many resources that are available on our website. Some of those involving the sharing of protected health information, our EMS body worn quick start guide that goes through issues that have to be looked at there. There was recently a case in, I believe it's the state of Oregon, whereby it implicated a camera in the back of the ambulance, not necessarily a body camera, but we're starting to look again at, the laws surrounding that as well. So here's our quick roadmap. We're going to talk about how AI is already being utilized in some EMS agencies. And a lot of you you may say, well, it's really new for us. We really haven't used AI, in its full capacity. Some of you may be using, a simple ChatGPT, Claude, or whatever product, generative AI in your daily life. And we'll talk about what to look out for in using that. What the regulatory landscape looks like, it is a bit the Wild West right now. So we can kind of see where the law is going, but we really don't have a lot of comprehensive laws. A few states have stepped in and we'll talk about some of those examples. Where some of those risks live for EMS and some of the things that we may not be thinking about, things like shadow IT. There are things that maybe we're using, or our staff, our workforce members are using that we don't even know about, and it could be exposing us to risk. And then lastly, building some governance around this, because it's really all about, how do we get the reins on it? And when I talk to a lot of organizations, one of the things that they'll say is, we don't have a policy on AI right now. And I say, okay. And they say, well, we don't really use AI and we don't permit the use of AI as of right now. We're only beta testing products or we haven't even thought about implementing that. Well, if that's your stance, then that should be your policy. Your policy is really easy. We do not permit the use of any unapproved AI products, right? So policies in this realm are really going to be specific to your agency and how you're utilizing that. And just you are an AI user, right? Siri and Alexa, they are AI products. If you ever watch a movie, right? And the next one that queues up is very similar to the one that you were watching, that genre. That's all AI. That's collecting information about you and using predictive analytics. And yes, your phone is spying on you, right? We've all had the experience where we've just had a conversation about something and then all of a sudden, lo and behold, we're, scrolling for something, we Googled something, and then the ad is the exact things that we're looking at. I even had the experience where sometimes I think I'm just thinking about something and it still shows up on my ad screen. So who knows? But you are an AI user. There is different types of AI technologies. So getting some of the lingo down, we have things that are embedded, so they're built in as adjuncts to other products, things like Copilot. If you have any EPCR hard stops in your EPCR application, that's technology that is built in, as an adjunct to other products. Generative AI, where it creates content in response to a prompt. And as I use AI and use different products right now, I'm using a lot of Claude in my daily life, to do a lot of research. It really helps me get to the answer. And it shows me all the sources that it's searching from as well. Well, I'm getting better and better. The technology is getting better about learning me, right? It kind of knows, it gives me in the context of EMS, and it knows that I'm looking for specifically things related to the industry. But as I'm using this AI product, my prompts are getting better and better. And some of the things that I'm using now are poke holes in my argument here, or what am I not thinking about? So the better you get at prompting AI, the better you're going to be at gaining different perspectives. And the other big prompt that I always use is show me the citation to where you got this. Because I have to go, as an attorney, I have a duty to go to the original source and make sure that I fact check that. Can't tell you how many times my clients have sent me something and they'll say, ChatGPT told me this today, and I think we could do this or whatever. And then I'll go back in and try to run those queries. And turns out, lo and behold, there's really no source for that. And ChatGPT, a lot of that stuff's populated from Reddit, Wikipedia, and other sources that can be sometimes unverified. Agentic AI as well. For those of you familiar with this, what you have are things running in the background like agents, right? For example, I have a prompt that every week searches for new regulation affecting EMS in the labor realm, in the privacy and security realm, as well as reimbursement. So that acts independently. I don't have to prompt it every week. It will, on a weekly basis, shoot out new initiatives that I go to and determine whether or not there is an effect. So all sorts of different types of fun stuff out there. And what I would encourage you to do, if you're not using AI yet, or you've only sort of dabbled in it, I would recommend that, just kind of use it on a beta basis, try to get familiar with it and see what it can really do, because I think it can free up our time to do a lot of what we want to do. So some of the ways that we're using AI and EMS today, some of the more common ways that we've seen. And by the way, they're using it overseas, especially in Canada with intelligent dispatch, where it will listen to the dispatcher over the radio to listen to the caller. And it's been pointed out that AI is more effective at spotting a potential MI based on the conversation than a human is. So they're using it in a lot greater capacity in other countries as well, in Switzerland as well. So a couple of examples, I already mentioned dispatch and call taking, where they can, based on the complaint there, they're scoring priority. Whereas, a lot of PSAPs dispatch centers are going through the MPDS or cards right now, or some of our dispatch centers aren't really using anything. It's, do you need fire, EMS, whatever. Documentation, we've seen this. We had auto-generated narratives a while ago. We're seeing a new iteration of that in some of our EPCR products, whereby you go in, and as long as you have a certain requisite amount of information, you go and have AI generate the narrative output of that. So we'll talk about that. There's also spell check, completeness prompts that we're using. One of the biggest things that we neglect to get is a valid signature, on behalf of the patient. So it can prompt us to make sure that we're complete in everything we need to do for documentation. Also scheduling, workforce analytics. We'll talk about some of those products that are utilized by agencies. QA and QI, this can be great if it's self-contained and we aren't populating PHI into like an open source thing. And we'll talk about those concerns in a little bit here, but good at doing chart review, flagging missing elements and stuff. I use it in grading, right? I can plug in a metric and have it score the paper, as long as we have requisite information in there. And, there are applications using it in billing and coding decisions, especially to pinpoint the accurate ICD-10 code that's appropriate for billing that particular claim. So AI and documentation training, you can use it to show your folks what good documentation looks like. Now, I mentioned, plugging my grading rubric in. You need to plug things like your protocols, and other standing orders that would be in play that should guide some of this. And if you have, even particular parameters that are set by your medical director, AI needs to know that. But what it can do, here's an example of a prompt, you know, um, please include accurate assessment findings, create a realistic narrative for a 68-year-old. And then here's what was generated from that. So you can show your folks, this is what you documented, but we can get better and we can show good examples. Because one of the things that we don't do a good job at in documentation is often giving them good examples of what good and thorough documentation looks like. So it's been utilized with those parameters. Just recently, I teach for a local community college. And what we had them do was they witnessed 4 different scenarios out in the field. So they were mock scenarios that they put on. And then they documented commensurate with that event. They did their EPCR documentation. And they were told, by the way, that they were going to be questioned, or not that they were going to be questioned, they were going to be graded on that documentation. So, you're already skewing towards better documentation that we would usually get. What I had AI do was parse all of those narratives that I was given, all of his EPCRs, and it gave me a script to ask questions. So this is an example of my narrative here. I started out with, hey, in your narrative, you wrote that the patient was fully assessed in that 4th line. And I put them like they were on the witness stand. And then I said, can I direct your attention to your assessment on page 2? Now the chest exam says posterior not assessed, right? So I went back and I said, so you told us you did a full assessment. That's not accurate. And that was really telling and eye-opening for a lot of my students. They're like, well, I didn't think I would ever, be questions on like an inconsistency like that. And they were struggling for the right answer. Now, of course, this can be explained away, but this was a really good training exercise, and I was able to use AI in the assistance of in assisting me in doing that. Agentic staffing. So you could have a staffing model. I still go to agencies who staff the same 24/7, right? No matter what time of day it is, no matter what day of the week, et cetera, they staff the same. They just staff up for, or maybe they have a lighter crew in the early morning hours or whatever. There are staffing agents and products out there that you can utilize, that can take into account your call volume history, and time and day patterns. And what they can do is generate, an ideal type of needs schedule for for those events, moving forward. And people can go in and, type in when they're available, and it can do all that stuff that we bang our heads against the wall, half the time trying to get back and adequately staff, for our needs. Well, that's the way that we do that. If we have agents that are constantly looking back, I mean, think about how much historical data that you have that you could feed into something to let it know, here are historical trends on each day of the week, and depending on this, and depending on, events or weather, if we have a concert coming up, these agents can be a really, really good tool for your staffing models. QA/QI agents, right? You can have them, and like I said, with appropriate protections in place. So we're either scrubbing out any protected health information, or we can use an internal product that wouldn't be an open source product, but a QA/QI agent that can review charts and actually score them, and can generate reports. I have an agency that at the end of every month, they give each of their individuals a documentation report. And it also says, this is how you scored against other individuals. Here's how you scored against everybody at the entire agency. And they can be utilized as helpful resources to pinpoint some of those activities and some of the things that we're missing. And like I said, too, not only with privacy concerns, make sure you're comfortable if you are going to utilize something like an open source product like ChatGPT. When you go type something into that, that's connected to the internet, right? And there's a lot of disclaimers and stuff in there that basically says, hey, once you punch that information in, it's out there, right? So make sure that any information that you would punch into an open source agent, that we know what's happening with that and we're comfortable with putting that information in there. Again, we'll talk about some of the HIPAA concerns and privacy concerns in just a moment here. Smarter revenue cycle management too, and looking at suggested codings with human intervention there. We are sometimes leaving money on the table, and we can spot situations where, hey, this could have been coded under the ALS assessment rule. And we missed that opportunity because we weren't adequately looking at the claim and we're only looking for an intervention there. So there are, RCM companies and services that bill in-house that are really trying to use AI to predict better outcomes. The worst bucket to be in RCM is that patient pay bucket, right? So they have predictive analyses that can tell you what are the chance of this going into a private patient pay bucket. What are the chance of recouping on that, based on the patient's past history, and information that we have about them. So strongly encourage you to look at some of those opportunities there. There are a lot of challenges. We have a lot of complex rules and rules that are payer specific. And the big thing right now is, Medicare Advantage is becoming more heavily selected than regular Medicare. And they have slightly different rules. The coverage rules are basically the same, but the way that the cost sharing breaks down is entirely different. So we have more predictive products because you're going to have more people that end up usually with Medicare Advantage plans that will end up in that patient pay bucket because they have higher deductibles and they can do that. But if we have a product that's able to score that and take a look at it, we've had folks utilize and put in, their payment breakdown, and they said, predict what it would look like if I lost 10% of people that were otherwise Medicaid eligible. Because as we know, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, one of the big things that it did was made it more of a challenge to enroll in the Medicaid program. And a lot of folks, we anticipate over the next couple of years, as these initiatives are put into place, we're going to see more people that are kicked off of out of Medicaid eligibility. So we want to be able to predict what that looks like in the future. If I can today, talk to my city council or whomever might issue a subsidy, predict that they can probably plan for that in future budgets versus you go to them, at the end of the fiscal year and say, hey, we need to plug a gap here. So let's look at, this is probably the primary reason, Ryan, tell me what the laws and the rules are out there. Well, it really is right now a little bit of the Wild West. From the federal side, there is no federal comprehensive AI statute right now. So, excuse me. There was an executive order that was issued, so the president can issue executive orders, but executive orders do not make law. It's kind of like this. They can direct certain enforcement in certain areas. So, for example, medical marijuana, the feds can say we are not going to enforce that on a federal level. That's an executive order. It doesn't change the fact that it's scheduled, how it's scheduled, but it changes the enforcement of it. So it's a non-binding resolution here, basically encourages the Department of Justice to scrutinize certain state laws if they think it's inconsistent with, more federal directives, but it doesn't govern anything on the AI side. There was also, a lot of people don't know about this, under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, there was an initiative that proposed a 10-year state moratorium on the regulation of AI. In other words, it would have prevented states from passing any laws for 10 years if it went into the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. It was not. It was voted down 99-1, and they said, "No, we're going to let states regulate this." So, whether or not that was good or bad, I don't know. It creates sort of a mishmash of different laws. Now, there are other laws that are implicated here. Okay, certainly HIPAA. Remember that we deal with a lot of PHI, and any protected health information that goes to a third party organization, and an AI vendor, we have to make sure that we have appropriate safeguards in there, usually in the form of a business associate agreement. Now, there are some AI products who do deal specifically in healthcare. They will sign a business associate agreement and they will tell you what that governs and what applications that you can use. But that's the implication under HIPAA. Under the Claims Act, a lot of AI-driven billing. So the OIG's compliance guidance says it's going to flag AI-generated prompts. And there was a False Claims Act settlement just recently that there's already exposure in the billing area. So, for example, if you're using products to make those predictive analytics, there still usually needs to be somebody making the final determination as to whether or not that code was correct, because you are still responsible. It can't be an excuse that, oh, AI made the mistake here. There was also a provision in the Affordable Care Act. It was the non-discrimination in clinical algorithms. And they added another rule in 2024 to that Non-Discrimination Act, and it basically says that, these models built on historical data need to be bias reviewed. When we look at studies from the past, a lot of times what we see is that data, especially those, who were doing studies, a lot of that data had come from white populations, populations that tended to have more resources. So that can be skewed. So they do have to be analyzed for that. That usually doesn't implicate much of EMS, but that's just a federal law that could be implicated. Now, I'm not going to go over the state laws, but here's a few examples of states that currently have some significant AI laws in effect, and we'll summarize sort of the general theme and pattern here. But a lot of them, like I said, are doing it we're doing it on a state by state basis. A lot of them start with employment, and any discrimination in that realm, but they can pass more significant, they can either do targeted laws or more significant laws in effect, that generally govern the use of all AI. And the big thing too is how they define AI, right? Because technically Google predictive analytics, that's AI, right? That's using a product like that. So the devil's really in the details with some of these state laws here. There's 45 states that have had AI bills introduced. So almost all of the states have introduced some form of a law that seeks to regulate AI. And we've been tracking over 1,500 different laws that tend to regulate in the AI sector. And about 20% of those bills became law in a recent bill cycle. So my dear colleague Scott Moore had done some research on this, and he's got a really great paper out there available through the AAA that talks about some of the enforcement and the regulatory body that's governing AI. And for example, the state of New York just issued advisory 26-1. You can go online, Google that, and find it. But some of their key take homes here are, hey, AI is a tool. It's not a replacement for the human element here. And EMS providers, they remain accountable for the end product. So once you sign it and send it off, you can't, say that was AI's fault. That we need to obviously protect patient privacy, verify the output, rereading things. That we need policies. We need to train our personnel, carefully evaluate our vendors and see what they're doing with the data, and then obviously monitor for AI bias and errors as well. NEMSIS as well put out some guidances, and some of those tenets are, human review every time. And that's where we see a lot of these laws going as well, that there still has to be a human in the loop, especially where we're making things like diagnostic decisions, to determine whether or not somebody's got, because there are AI products that have gotten better at spotting, potential malignancies than human beings, but they still want a human in that transaction there. Audit trails, they want documentation accountability, that the clinician remains fully accountable for that. And they also focus on vendor vetting as well. So here's the bottom line, okay? A lot of these laws are saying human in the loop. In other words, if we get something that's generated by AI, there has to be a final check by a human being that says we're good to go. Now, I know if we bring that into, say, documentation, right? So we'll tell the providers, hey, you're responsible for reviewing that. What are they going to do after they hit generate narrative, right? It's probably like it doesn't get a fresh set of eyes. That becomes a training issue for us, to remind the provider that they are responsible to go back. And if we see things that are inconsistent, we do have to go back and remind the providers that they are ultimately responsible for that. In certain cases, some of these AI laws require disclosure to patients. So, if we see that coming into and implicating EMS a little more, right now I've seen it with laws that we need to disclose if we're going to use that information to make a final determination. We've all gone to physicians, or some of us have, to physicians recently, and they've said, "Hey, I'm going to record this conversation." They disfavor black box AI. In other words, we have to be able to go back and look at the resources that it's drawing from. Is it drawing from a legitimate site, with the state approved protocols, or is it a secondary site like Wikipedia that just references those? Audits for bias, we're seeing those written into a lot of laws. So if we see, things like disparate treatment of a certain population as a result of this, and it's generating things, we have to audit for that. And regulation for an employment is big, so check with your employment attorney. So other big part of this too is, where do the risks live? Okay, where do those AI risks live for EMS? So we're different. Number one, the big distinction is a lot of our information is protected health information, anything about patients. So there's this additional layer of patients' trust that we're going to safeguard that information. And we're not going to just willy-nilly type it into a chat box that could later be archived on the internet. And then when the machines come to take over, they're going after you first because they know you have this particular condition. We obviously have privacy laws that I already talked about. Also, public exposure as well. Sometimes we're putting in information that could be confidential and proprietary, and we got to make sure that we have policies that cover those sorts of things. So, for example, I had just recently, I'll just use an example from my own lawyer experience here. Somebody called me up, one of my clients, and they said, "Hey, I have something to show you." And they sent me a link to a site, and it was a public site. I went in, and what it said was, please type in, as much demographic info or as much information about your patient as you know, and it will generate the narrative for you. And it was a site that was created by one of their paramedics. And lo and behold, they had been using it, and a lot of their providers have been using this particular product to generate some of their narratives. The big issue there is, they had no idea that they were using that. And they didn't have a policy on it either. Obviously, they locked it down as soon as they discovered that this was happening, but never permit the use of unapproved AI tools. Okay. So period, that if we have no policy whatsoever, we can write a policy that says, all AI use has to be through the use of specifically approved AI products. And if you have any that are approved, list them. If there are none that are approved, then we state that none have been approved yet. So that's called shadow IT, right? Sometimes our field providers, us in the office, in the background, we're utilizing these tools to become more efficient. But, if we're recording things or asking, ChatGPT to create a disciplinary memo or an evaluation, that's the use of shadow IT, denial trends, wearables, right? That's a big thing. Just recently, I was actually at an agency in Colorado, and they said a couple of our firefighters who are also paramedics are using the Meta glasses, and they're going out into the field. And they're like, "Is that a issue?" And I said, "Yeah, that's a big issue because they're capturing now PHI, and that's being uploaded to a cloud that you have no control over." So, going back and reviewing that, that's going to a place that you have no control over that. So there's exposure for PHI. First and foremost, if we're going to allow PHI, we're going to populate PHI to any AI third-party product. We have to have a business associate agreement in place. There are a couple of applications, as I said before, that will sign a BAA, and we have to check what the safeguards are. We also have to say they're not going to further utilize that PHI for any other purposes. The ungoverned tools can create, other attack surfaces, ways into your system for breaches. It can hallucinate, okay? One of the things, especially that we've seen in ChatGPT, is if you type something in and you don't type, the full information, it will make it up, right? It's going to presume that you did a basic assessment of the patient. Maybe you didn't punch in anything, regarding your basic assessment. A lot of times it'll go back and it'll just make that information up and even a medical history. So that's an issue. And like I said, those wearables, they passively capture patient conversations and other protected health information. So some big dangers there. And that's why we really need to have a policy surrounding that and regarding the use of PHI. And if we're going to introduce that, there have to be guardrails there. So let's talk about EMS documentation. So there are products out there, like I said, EPCR products where they have the ability to generate an EPCR narrative. And a lot of times there will be sort of a disclaimer that says generated by the user or with the assistance of AI. And that's sort of the disclaimer. What I've encouraged a lot of my clients to do is to beta test it and see what they're getting. I will say, the results are mixed right now. Some of the folks are saying this has been a great adjunct. We have complete sentences, actual grammar. It's not texting lingo. We love it. Other folks are saying it's just not as accurate as we would like it to be. And we have to go back oftentimes and fix the narrative, and make iterations to that. So it's costing us more time. But the one thing that I want you to remember is context. It's a difficult thing for AI to pick up, right? It's not going to know what the weather was like, what the scene looked like, in the two situations like, how you doing? Or how you doing? Two totally different contexts based on what they're saying there. For example, if you just state that the patient fell, there's no way for them to build context if you're not, if you're using a product that won't hallucinate and make stuff up, no clue whether or not if they fell from a standing position or they fell from, an 8-foot ladder. And obviously that's critically important there. Also pertinent negatives as well. If we just punch in 72-year-old male, fell approximately 8 feet from ladder, complains of right hip pain, vital stable. If AI never mentions that they denied, loss of consciousness, head strike, anticoagulant use, there are implications for that, right? Different trauma assessments, liability later on. The patient comes back and, there was a brain bleed that wasn't properly screened for. And we said, well, we did ask the patient if they were taking warfarin sodium. Well, it's not in your report now. So pertinent negatives have to be included. It can cause a number of different things. Like I said, even in the clinical realm, if you say denied chest pain, but the patient later develops, crushing chest pain, that's an issue. So, and even in the legal context as well, depending on what the output is, ruled out this for the patient. A lot of times we can't definitively rule anything out. And if AI is generating something that's that definitive, that becomes an issue when we're on the stand. Well, you definitively ruled that out, yet this is what the patient was suffering from. So that's a really, really big issue. Bottom line, it is a good tool for some of the organizations. It's really helpful in drafting initial narratives for human review there, and then being able to correct things, make it logically tell a story. Where it fails, that context, not getting hot context, hallucinating, and those pertinent false negatives that we talked about. So build in that accountability, make sure that they have audit logs that we can sort of what was generated by the AI product and what we generated. And human review is absolutely mandatory. Never ever should we have a final EPCR go out that has not undergone human review. And what we suspect is a lot of these state laws that are going to be upcoming and ones that might encompass EMS, they're likely going to include that element that there needs to be. What they call it is human in the loop. Other risks, clinical care and bias. We already talked about this. Healthcare tools have shown measurable error rates. And remember, a lot of that historical data, that all depends on, where that historical data came from. So make sure that, routine clinical questions to crew protocol, they go to and consult protocols and medical command for those issues. We already talked about labor and employment law a little bit, but if we're going to use these products in screening applicants, looking at their pension to leave the organization, you got to loop in, your HR, definitely legal on these issues if we're going to use AI in any of these screenings. And if you're in a unionized workforce, that becomes critically important. If we're going to use a scheduling application, that could be a mandatory bargaining issue that we have to go to, to determine, are we going to allow this AI product dictate our schedules here? Recording devices, remember, in addition to those privacy rules, wiretapping and consent laws. So the states highlighted in orange in this picture here are two-party consent states, meaning both parties to a recording have to consent to being recorded. And that was one of the issues in the recent Oregon case. The individual did not, well, actually, it was a two-party consent state here, but one of the issues that they were arguing was that the individual didn't know that they were being recorded. So if we're going to use these recording devices, make sure that we're following the right parameters. And one of the resources I'm going to point you to is one I already mentioned, that body worn camera quick start guide. That will guide you through any sort of recording device and some of the common issues that inure to the use of recording out in the field there. Not only the HIPAA issues, but state open records laws, because the more information that we create. Just yesterday, I had a client call me up and they were asking for the dash cam video. And I said, well, under HIPAA, that's not part of the designated record set. And the individuals threatened to, take a complaint to the Attorney General and OCR. And they decided, rather than have to answer those complaints, they were just going to give the dash cam video. But there are implications, especially if you're a public agency, under your right to know laws and FOIA and those types of laws, whether or not you have to produce that stuff. And you got to decide how long, if you're going to record things, how long you're going to retain that as well. So how do we build governance? We'll take us home here. Some of the core policy guide rails. No PHI to AI tools without a business associate agreement, period. And you have to have agency approval. We're going to ask, where that information is kept. We're going to ask whether or not it's encrypted all the time. And we're going to ask that vendor not to ever utilize any confidential or protected health information beyond what we're using it for. In other words, they can't use it to go populate some other database that's aggregating data. Human in the loop, always. We've been preaching this. Make sure your audit logs are good so that we can create what happened throughout every iteration of that record. With vendor accountability, making sure, like I said, that they will sign a business associate agreement. And by the way, some of these AI products, for example, Claude is part of the larger Anthropic, and Anthropic uses a bunch of different plugins. Some of their plugins, they will sign a business associate agreement and say, we will protect and safeguard your PHI if you're using these plugins, but not these. So that becomes a little bit nuanced. And training over prohibition. Anytime something new comes along, the natural tendency is like, well, let's just ban it first, right? We'll figure out where we're going. AI is here. It's here to stay. And we need to figure out, it's usually a better practice not to outright ban something, especially if it has utility and can be useful. We just have to make sure that we're training our staff on what's appropriate. You need a policy on AI, okay? We have developed some policies for agencies, very sort of bare bones and basic. And we're going to be developing sort of more of a larger policy, I think, in the months to come here. But make sure that this policy truly represents what you want to do in your agency. And it's very simple. Nobody can use unapproved AI products, no PHI or confidential information, using AI if that's and here are the specific uses that we're going to be looking at. So, quick call to action here, as we when I look at EMS now, just recently we hosted a conference in Clearwater Beach and we were getting demographic information from the folks. There were a lot of folks with 25 plus years experience in EMS, and they have all this institutional knowledge. And then there were a lot of folks, the other large contingent in the room were folks that were younger. And the missing was that gap in the middle there, the leaders that are upcoming. There was a big delta there. And one of the things that a lot of the leaders are telling me is like, I am just swamped in all of these routine tasks and scheduling and everything else. I never get around to leading and training people. This you could be seen as an opportunity for you as, an AI augmented leader. We need to get away from just labeling something as good or bad. It's neither, right? It's technology. It's neutral. It can be used for good. It can be used for bad. Can it breed laziness? Sure. Under certain circumstances, but does it have a utility? Sure. Do more with less is what we're always told. We're mired in some of these tasks. I've found in my own practice, AI to be a helpful adjunct in, pinpointing sources of information, just creating images. By the way, most of the images including this image here, has been generated with AI. You know how much time I save in putting together a presentation? Probably hours in time because you want it to be visually appealing, but that takes a lot of time. And it did in the old era without AI when I had to like put things in certain spaces and boxes and highlights and everything else. Just simple things like that can clear up time for us to do other things. As what they say, it's not necessary to change. Survival is not mandatory. So, key takeaways here. It's already in your agency. The question is whether or not you have governed it and whether or not you've pinpointed potential sources of shadow IT. PHI and open source, not without a BAA and appropriate guardrails there. With state law, it's an active battlefield. So make sure that you're tracking any bills that could potentially implicate EMS and other areas that you're working in, like labor law. Federal preemption up to this point, and there's been, as far as I've seen, not a huge initiative to take this on. AI supports human decisions, right? It never replaces them. There's always accountability. And, a trained and consistently enforced policy is absolutely essential for your organization. So, always like to give you a little bit of homework. So, next steps, try to inventory any AI technology that's being used in your agencies, right? And look for, like I said, shadow IT. It's like the folks that often tell me, well, we don't store PHI locally. That's our APCR vendor, or that's our billing company that stores all that information. Every time I go to the recycle bin, the temporary download files, things like that, I always discover that there's PHI living locally. So you need to ask folks, are they using Dropbox or Google products to share those things and or utilizing ChatGPT just to give them information because there needs to be parameters around that. Because if they're putting confidential information into those searches or, patient information, that could be a problem. Get your appropriate stakeholders together. Now, one of the things that you don't want to do is leave everybody out of the process. Just write your own policy and say this is, the edict. Make sure that you have everybody heard at the table. You ask your providers, what are your needs and what are some reasonable safeguards there? And then obviously, goes for legal review before finalizing any final technology. So with that, I've left a little bit of time for questions here. So I'll turn to Chris if he's seen anything, or you can raise your hand, and Chris is sort of looking at everybody to see if there are any hands up. Happy to answer any questions. Like I said, I will provide a copy of the slides, and I'm happy. My email, by the way, is rStark@pwwemslaw.com. So anybody can reach out to me if they want additional information or if they have questions. Please feel free. But big area right now, and it's really burgeoning.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I think you've had everyone completely enraptured for this entire presentation because you're getting thanks and great presentations and kudos here. Uh, so, looking ahead to just get you kind of started on questions here, what do you think is like the most exciting thing that you see, as like a legally not safest, but like where people can start putting their toes in the water on this that you see over the next few years in AI and EMS?
I think the big area is the connection of outcome data with dispatch data, making that full connection, being able to look and support that we're making the correct decisions in between that time, right? We are mired in this old, well, we've always done it this way. Here's our standing protocols. But the reason we were boarding patients was flawed, the rationale behind that. So that's really exciting for me is to be able to say, here's what the patient's outcome is. And the other thing is providing that information to providers really enhances the experience and job satisfaction for them because they have no idea whether or not the skills they performed, the care they provided, or whatever, made a difference for them. So I think that's critically important.
Very cool. Let's see, we have a question from Clay that says, if you use AI in a report, do you need to state that AI was used in your narrative?
Great question. There's no legal requirement currently. There is the only requirement that I'm aware of right now is in the state of Texas, and what they do state is you must disclose to any patient if you make a diagnostic decision based on an AI output. So currently, there's no legal requirement. I have found, however, that a lot of products do state that it was generated through the use of AI. And I think what they're anticipating is that transparency. A lot of these laws are focused on, like I said, transparency in those decision makings. So we are seeing, especially in the practitioner realm where we have, licensed physicians, nurses, et cetera, there's a lot of resistance to AI making any sort of final determination there. These patients want to be assured that at the end of the day, it's my doctor making that decision, not some product. But you do not, as a matter of law, have to disclose that. The only reason that would go, be the case is if there was a contractual provision that required something like that.
Gotcha. And let's see if we got um, kind of a follow up on that. So you're mentioning the like human element, keeping the human in the loop.
Mhm.
Could you go a little bit further into that? Like how does that specifically protect agencies, like having the clinician or dispatcher making the final call? Like what does that look like?
Yeah. So, what we have to show, for example, in EPCR generation, what I would want to see, what a lot of the AI products do is they say reviewed and approved by, this particular clinician. What that prevents is, what I see is on the stand, when we have somebody say, you mean you didn't write this thing, right? You didn't generate this, so a machine generated this. So that protects the provider when they say, no, I actually went back and reviewed all of these and I attested that I reviewed the information that PCR. So from that realm, it also engenders, just more trust among your patient population. Usually, there's less of that in EMS, but especially, when I go see my physician, if they are using products, recording the conversation, things like that, it's just adding a layer of transparency there. All of our decisions are checked. So I do believe that it's going to become a legal requirement for a lot of medical records in the future that there needs to be a human in the loop. Now, granted, this was the same thing, remember when we were trying to develop self-driving cars, right? And we always had to have a person in there in case, it did the wrong thing. For gosh, you go back to 100 years ago, there always used to be an operator for your elevator, right? And
Hmm.
when people got into that elevator and they said, "What? I just press a button and nobody's going to be in there to make sure this operates correctly." That was a huge shift. And that's what we're seeing now. So there may come a time where the AI has gotten so good and so much information's been embedded. In fact, the studies on self-driving cars are that they have a pretty safe track record. So there may come a point where that's not there, but that is sort of the driver and the driverless car stage is what we're in. So that's what that's based on.
Gotcha. Yeah, great answer. Let's see here. Did you mentioned the you mentioned a little bit about like the AI hallucination issues that could happen there. What's the best way for people if that does happen? Do you have like advice on catching those?
You have to read critically, right? So after
Hmm.
I generate whatever's there, and that becomes the inherent problem with with field providers. We know that their documentation is not fun to do. It's usually the most loathed portion of doing that job. A lot of the guardrails that I've seen around that are the data inputs have to meet a certain threshold before it will even generate an output. In other words, I can't just put in basic demographic information and chief complaint and say generate my report. I've got to include and agencies right now the products are making the decision as what's the requisite amount. I think we'll probably reach a stage where the agency decides what is the requisite amount of data points that we have to have in there before we'll even allow the provider to use that, because that's going to prevent hallucinations in the software. And those particular products, the self-contained products, usually are told do not input anything. For example, with my Claude profile, I've told it, I told it what my job is, and I said, I view above all completely accurate, verified, sourced information, and I don't want you to give me anything that is unverified, by some source. Please give me all those resources. So that's how we can sort of protect against that.
Gotcha. So it's probably important that if people are, like you said, that the technology is not going anywhere, so that the point of being familiar of like what's actually going on with it right now is probably pretty important because whatever the next step is going to be will probably necessitate understanding of what the previous step was.
Hmm.
That makes sense, right? Like
Yep.
getting to level two when you've been on level one. That
Yep.
makes sense. Okay,
100%.
so like if people wanted to start today, like you were saying, like they've kind of looked around, they've this emerging technology, not sure to how to engage with it and stuff like that, and now they've been convinced by this great presentation today to get on board and start doing stuff. What's first step? What do they go with their action steps today and start working on a plan?
Well, obviously it's role dependent, right?
Hmm.
So look at the resources that are available to you. If your PCR product does allow, a generated narrative, maybe turn that feature on a beta basis for a little while and track all of those and make sure that there's 100% review. If you're working in administration, I would take a policy, right? And update this policy per the recent regulations. And, if you're using a good product, you're going to have to pay for the product typically, right?
Hmm.
If you want good outputs, but you can put in a policy and say, update this policy for this, or write me a you could say, write me a basic policy on AI, go back and review that. And then the more information you give it and parameters you give it, you can utilize it for that. Where I've seen a lot of benefit is especially in the scheduling realm. I've seen a lot of agencies go out and use products for their scheduling. So that's a good way to sort of dip your toe in the water, so to speak. But just on a personal level, I would encourage people before they make a judgment about it or it's lazy or it's a shortcut. I would encourage you to use it. And I would always encourage you to say show sources, for that information and see what it can do for you. It can do amazing things. The other thing that AI is excellent at is summarizing things. So if you
Hmm.
have a large rule, a new mandate that's coming up and you ask it certain things, I mean, it can execute those prompts within a few seconds. You can take, for example, one of my colleagues is going to school right now. He's going to nursing school. He took his entire downloadable textbook and put it into Notes. I think it's Notes LM is the product that he uses.
Hmm.
And he says, turn this into a podcast so I can listen to it instead of reading this book because he's, an audible learner. So he's using that, on that realm for training. It can generate video outputs and update and refresh your training. One of the things that we're trying to do, we have this really old HIPAA video that's still on DVD. We want to take that and generate a more evergreen output so it won't look stale every couple of years. So there are multiple opportunities. I would just encourage you, what's that one thing that I find myself mired in all of the time? For some of us, it might be emails. My colleague Shannon, he has two emails sent to him every day, and he says, "Tell me the ones that I have to respond to." Now he says I always go back and just do a double check on that, but he said it saves me a lot of time because it sort of prioritizes things where it can tell from context that hey, this is really important. You need to respond to them right away.
Perfect. Awesome. Okay, so thank you so much. We might have time for one more quick answer here. Can you talk about the benefits of a DUA in the era of AI?
I haven't thought about that, so I don't want to
Okay.
tread into that yet. I haven't done a DUA in a couple of years. Last time was with a big healthcare system.
Okay.
Um,
That's fine.
I
Yeah.
yeah, I'd have to think about that.
No
But
problem. We'll have that for we'll do a part two of this presentation in a while, and
sure,
you can have that
sure,
on there.
sure. But
Perfect.
yeah,
Okay.
I'd like to think through that first. But
No worries.
Mona, feel free to reach out to me.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, so we got 2 minutes left here, so I want a big virtual round of applause for our presenter from the audience here. Sure appreciate your time. Always fantastic information. This video will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, and it will also be on the NEMSIS website by the end of the week. So if you want to share this, review this with any of your colleagues, feel free. Ryan said he's going to get us this information, so if you need a copy of the information here, let us know by going to nemsis.org and filling out a ticket by pressing the red button at the very bottom of the page, and we'll get you a copy of that information. Again, if you want to be notified about this or other events that the NEMSIS TAC is hosting, hit that red button, say that you'd like to be part of the mailing list, or follow us at NEMSIS TAC on all the major social media sites. Ryan, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. And we'll see everybody next time.
Thank you.